The day he called her a mistake was the day she stopped asking to be chosen. The hospital room was too quiet for a moment that should have been filled with celebration. The soft hum of machines replacing what should have been laughter. Naomi Brooks lying still against the crisp white sheets as the city of Manhattan flickered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows like a distant constellation that no longer belonged to her. Her fingers curled weakly around the edge of the blanket, her other hand resting protectively over the life she had just brought into the world, a life that entered without the presence of a father who once promised forever under golden lights and whispered vows that now felt like echoes from someone else's story. The overhead lights cast a sterile glow across her deep brown skin, highlighting the quiet strength in her eyes rather than the exhaustion. Because even in this moment she refused to break in a way anyone could see. The nurse adjusted something beside her and offered a gentle smile, the kind reserved for moments that carried both joy and absence. And Naomi returned it with grace, because dignity was the only thing she had left that no one could take from her, not even him, not even Ethan Whitmore, whose name still lingered in the corners of her mind like a shadow she had learned not to chase away too quickly, because shadows meant there was once light, and 5 years ago that light had been everything. A penthouse overlooking Central Park, evenings filled with champagne glasses catching reflections of amber sunsets, his hand at the small of her back as if the world might slip away without her anchored beside him. The kind of love that felt too precise to fail, too deliberate to fracture, until it did. Until the headlines replaced the whispers, until her name became something he erased with a sentence spoken too cleanly to be accidental. A chapter that had to end, he said, standing beside another woman beneath the flash of cameras. His voice measured, controlled, practiced, as if rewriting history required. Nothing more than confidence. And Naomi had watched it unfold not from a distance, but from the quiet center of a life unraveling. Her reflection in a glass screen staring back at her, as if asking a question she refused to answer out loud. Because some truths did not need to be spoken to be understood. The ring he once placed on her finger had felt heavier that day, not because of its weight, but because of what it no longer represented. And when she removed it later that night, setting it carefully on the cold surface of a marble table, it wasn't anger that guided her hand. It was clarity, the kind that arrives without warning and leaves no room for hesitation. And now here she was, years later compressed into a single breath. A single moment where everything that was lost had somehow transformed into something unbreakable. The soft cry from the bassinet pulled her back to the present, her gaze shifting slowly, deliberately, as if every movement carried intention. And when she looked at her child, really looked, something inside her steadied in a way that no apology ever could have repaired. Because this was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of one she would write on her own terms, outside the reach of promises that once defined her worth. And somewhere beyond the glass, the city kept moving, unaware that in a quiet hospital room high above its restless streets, a woman who had been abandoned without explanation had just become something far more powerful than the version of herself he chose to leave behind. She had become untouchable in her silence, unstoppable in her resolve, and, though he didn't know it yet, though the world still carried his name with reverence and power, there would come a day when Ethan Whitmore would walk back into her life expecting familiarity, expecting control, and instead find something he could neither recognize nor reclaim. And in that moment, he would understand what it truly meant to lose everything without realizing it until it was far too late. 5 years earlier the city had looked the same, but Naomi Brooks had not. She had stood in the reflection of a glass wall inside Ethan Whitmore's penthouse, the skyline stretching endlessly behind her like a promise she believed she had earned, her hand resting lightly over her stomach as if protecting a secret that had not yet been spoken aloud. The soft glow of evening wrapped around the room in warm gold tones, turning everything into something almost sacred. And for a moment she allowed herself to believe that this life was permanent, that love built with intention could not simply dissolve. She had rehearsed the words in her mind all afternoon, the way she would tell him, the way his expression would shift from curiosity to joy, the way his arms would wrap around her as if the world had finally given him something worth holding on to. But the door opened before she could speak, and everything changed without warning. Ethan stepped inside with the same controlled presence that had once made her feel safe, his tailored suit untouched by the chaos of the outside world, his expression unreadable in a way she had never seen before. The distance between them filled the room faster than any sound. Naomi smiled at first, instinctively, as if that alone could restore whatever had shifted in the air, but he did not return it. Instead, he placed his keys down with deliberate precision, the faint metallic sound echoing louder than it should have. And when he finally looked at her, really looked, there was something missing, something that had quietly disappeared without her noticing until that exact moment. She felt it then, not fear, but clarity creeping in like a slow sunrise, and still she tried. Her voice soft but steady as she spoke his name, as if saying it would remind him of everything they had built. But he did not respond the way she expected. Instead, he exhaled as if the conversation had already been decided long before he walked through that door. And when he spoke, his words were measured, distant, almost rehearsed. He told her that things had changed, that the life they created no longer fit the future he envisioned, that there were decisions he had to make for the sake of his empire. Words that sounded logical but felt hollow, and Naomi stood there listening, her hand still resting over the secret he did not know existed, her heart not racing, not breaking, but settling into a stillness that felt far more dangerous than pain. She realized then that love had not ended in that moment. It had ended quietly long before, hidden beneath business meetings and late nights and conversations that became shorter each time they tried to hold on to them. And when he mentioned her, the other woman, he did not say her name with guilt. He said it with certainty, as if choosing her was not a betrayal but a correction. And that was the moment Naomi understood everything. Not because he raised his voice or showed anger, but because he did not need to. His calm was the loudest confession of all. She did not cry. She did not ask him to reconsider. Instead, she simply nodded once, as if acknowledging a truth that had already been written. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet strength that surprised even herself. She told him that she understood, not because she agreed, but because she refused to stand where she was no longer valued. And that night, while the city continued to glow outside the windows, Naomi Brooks packed a single suitcase, left the ring behind on the marble table where it caught the light one last time, and walked out without looking back, carrying with her not just the life growing inside her, but a silence that would one day become her greatest power. The first winter after she left felt longer than any season Naomi Brooks had ever known, not because of the cold, but because of the silence that followed her everywhere. A small apartment on the edge of the city becoming her entire world, its narrow windows framing a skyline she once lived above, now distant and unreachable. The radiator humming unevenly through the night, as if struggling to keep up with a life that had been reduced to essentials. She learned quickly that survival was not dramatic. It was quiet and repetitive, measured in grocery lists, bus rides, and doctor visits she attended alone, her hand resting over her growing stomach not as a gesture of fear, but of promise, because every choice she made now carried weight beyond herself. There were nights when exhaustion pressed against her chest so heavily she could barely move, moments when the past tried to return in fragments of memory. The sound of his voice, the warmth of a place that no longer belonged to her. But she did not allow herself to linger there. She replaced those thoughts with something sharper, something forward-facing, a plan she began to build piece by piece with the same precision she once used to love him. She took on work wherever she could, late hours at a small financial consulting firm that did not ask questions as long as results were delivered. Her mind remained as sharp as ever. Numbers still aligned for her in ways they did not for others. And slowly, quietly, she began to rebuild something that was entirely her own, not grand at first, not visible, but solid, like a foundation poured in darkness before the structure rises into light. When her son was born, the world did not shift in the way she once imagined. There were no grand gestures or cinematic moments, just a soft cry that filled the small hospital room and anchored her in a reality that was both fragile and unshakable at the same time. She named him Elias, a name that carried strength without needing explanation. And from that moment forward, everything she did had direction. The days blurred into one another, sleepless nights folding into early mornings, but she moved through them with a steadiness that surprised even her. She did not wait for help that would not come. She created systems, schedules, discipline. Her apartment slowly transforming from a temporary shelter into a command center of quiet ambition, spreadsheets covering her small desk, ideas evolving into strategies, strategies into opportunities, and opportunities into something far more powerful than anyone could see from the outside. Years passed not as a countdown, but as a construction, each one adding another layer to the woman she was becoming. Her name began to circulate in circles that valued results over reputation, her work speaking in numbers that could not be ignored, investments that grew under her guidance, partnerships formed not through charm, but through undeniable precision, and eventually the small firm that once gave her a chance became something she outgrew, not with noise, but with quiet inevitability. Naomi Brooks did not announce her rise. She built it in such a way that by the time the world noticed, it was already too late to question it. And through it all, Elias remained her center, his laughter filling spaces that once echoed with absence, his presence a reminder that what was taken from her had been replaced with something far more enduring. She did not teach him about loss. She taught him about value, about standing where you are respected, about walking away without fear when you are not. And though she never spoke Ethan Whitmore's name again, she did not erase him either. She carried the lesson of him like a quiet blueprint, a reminder of what she would never accept again. And somewhere far beyond the life she had rebuilt, the world he inhabited continued to move forward as if nothing had changed, unaware that the woman he once dismissed had not disappeared. She had simply stepped out of sight long enough to become something he would not recognize when their paths inevitably crossed again. Success did not arrive with applause. It arrived quietly, disguised as a meeting that no one thought would matter. Naomi Brooks sat at the head of a long glass table overlooking downtown Manhattan, the same city that once witnessed her fall now reflecting her rise in every polished surface, her posture composed, her expression calm, the kind of calm that came from knowing exactly who she was and what she had built. Across from her sat a group of investors who had spent decades navigating power. Yet in this room, they listened when she spoke, not because of her past, but because of her precision. Every word she chose carried weight. Every number she presented told a story of growth that could not be dismissed. Brooks' pediatric initiative had started as a single facility, a place born from her own experience, designed to provide care that did not depend on privilege, and now it was expanding into a network, a system that combined compassion with strategy, something the market had underestimated until it was too late. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her authority lived in her restraint. And as the meeting concluded, signatures followed naturally, contracts sliding across the table as if they had always been meant to land. There, outside the conference room, the world moved at its usual pace. But inside, something had shifted permanently. Naomi Brooks was no longer building quietly. She had become impossible to ignore. Later that afternoon, she stood by the window of her office, Elias seated on the couch behind her, his small hands busy with a puzzle far more complex than most children his age would attempt, his focus unwavering, a reflection of the environment she had created for him, structured yet full of possibility. She turned slightly, watching him for a moment, not with softness alone but with pride, because everything she had endured had led to this, a life not defined by what she lost, but by what she chose to create. Her assistant's voice came through the intercom, measured but carrying a note of curiosity, informing her of a proposal that had just arrived, a major investment group seeking partnership for a large-scale expansion. Naomi listened without interruption, her gaze returning to the skyline as if searching for something beyond it. When the name of the group was mentioned, something in the air changed, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough for her to notice. Whitmore Holdings. The words settled into the room like a memory that refused to be ignored. She did not react immediately, her hand resting lightly against the cool glass as if grounding herself in the present. 5 years had passed since she last heard that name spoken in a way that mattered. 5 years since. She chose silence over confrontation, growth over bitterness, and now the past had found its way back into her carefully constructed present, not as a threat, but as an opportunity. She turned back toward her desk, her expression unchanged, her voice steady as she instructed her assistant to schedule the meeting. No hesitation, no avoidance, because this was no longer a story about what he had done. It was about who she had become. Elias looked up then, sensing the shift in the room in the way children often do, his eyes meeting hers with quiet curiosity, and she offered him a small smile, not to reassure him, but to remind herself that everything ahead would be handled with the same clarity that had carried her this far. The city lights began to flicker on as evening approached, each one reflecting against the glass like 1,000 silent witnesses, and somewhere within that vast network of power and ambition, Ethan Whitmore remained unaware that the next meeting on his calendar would not be just another business deal. It would be the moment he stepped back into a story he once walked away from. Only this time, he would not be the one in control. The morning of the meeting arrived without ceremony, the kind of morning that did not announce itself as significant, yet carried the weight of something irreversible beneath its surface. Naomi Brooks stood in front of the full-length mirror in her office, the city stretching behind her in sharp lines of steel and glass, her reflection steady, composed, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that spoke of authority without needing to declare it. There was no trace of hesitation in her posture, no visible echo of the woman who once stood in a different room waiting to be chosen. She adjusted the cuff of her sleeve with deliberate precision, a small movement that grounded her in the present, because today was not about the past, it was about alignment, about meeting a moment fully prepared. Across the city, Ethan Whitmore moved through his morning with the same efficiency that had defined his life for years, his schedule packed with decisions that shaped industries, his name still carrying weight in rooms where outcomes were negotiated in quiet tones and firm handshakes. He had reviewed the proposal the night before, Brooks' pediatric initiative, a fast-rising entity that had captured attention through performance rather than publicity. The numbers had impressed him, the structure had intrigued him, and yet there was something about it that he could not quite place, a familiarity that lingered just beyond recognition. He dismissed it as coincidence, because in his world, familiarity was often an illusion created by patterns, not people. The car ride to the meeting passed without distraction, the city unfolding outside his window in practiced rhythm, and when he arrived at the building, the exterior alone signaled that this was not a small operation. Glass doors opened to a lobby defined by clean lines and quiet confidence, not excess, not display, but intention. He stepped inside and was greeted with professionalism that matched his own expectations. Everything about the environment suggested control, foresight, something built with clarity rather than chance. He was escorted to the conference floor, the hallway lined with subtle details that reflected purpose rather than decoration, and as he walked, that faint sense of familiarity returned, stronger now, threading through his thoughts in a way that made him slow for just a fraction of a second, though he did not know why. Inside the conference room, the table was already set, documents arranged with precision, the city visible through expansive windows that mirrored the skyline he had spent years conquering. He took his seat, placing his briefcase beside him, his expression neutral, prepared for negotiation, prepared for control. The door remained closed for a moment longer than expected, and in that brief pause something shifted, not externally, but internally, as if time itself had decided to stretch just enough to make space for what was about to happen. Then the handle turned, slow, deliberate, the sound almost imperceptible, yet carrying the weight of inevitability. The door opened, and Naomi Brooks stepped into the room, not as someone returning, not as someone seeking acknowledgement, but as the person who owned the space entirely, her presence filling the room without effort, her gaze steady as it met his for the first time in 5 years. And in that instant, everything that had been buried beneath success, beneath control, beneath carefully constructed distance rose to the surface without permission. Ethan Whitmore did not speak. He did not move, because recognition arrived not as a gradual realization but as a complete and undeniable truth. The past was no longer behind him. It was standing directly in front of him, composed, unshaken, and entirely beyond his reach. And for the first time in a very long time, he did not know what to say. The silence that followed her entrance did not feel empty. It felt exact, as if every second had been measured and placed with intention. Naomi Brooks moved to her seat at the head of the table with calm authority, the soft sound of her heels against the polished floor echoing once before settling into stillness. She did not rush. She did not hesitate, because nothing in this room required urgency from her anymore. She placed her folder down, aligned it perfectly with the edge of the table, and only then did she look up again, her gaze meeting Ethan Whitmore's without strain, without question, without any trace of the past asking to be acknowledged. It was not indifference. It was something far more controlled, a clarity that left no space for misunderstanding. Ethan remained still for a moment longer than was appropriate in a room built on timing and precision, his hand resting lightly against the table as if grounding himself in a reality that had shifted too quickly to process. The recognition in his eyes did not fade. It sharpened, moving from disbelief into something heavier, something that carried the quiet weight of consequence. But Naomi did not give that moment room to grow. She began the meeting with a voice that was steady and professional, addressing him as she would any other partner, her tone neutral, her words deliberate, every sentence structured to move forward rather than backward. She spoke of expansion plans, of infrastructure, of long-term strategy that extended beyond individual gain into sustainable impact. Her presentation precise, her data undeniable, and as she spoke, the room adjusted around her, the power dynamic shifting not through confrontation but through undeniable presence. Ethan listened, not as a man revisiting a past he could not control, but as a businessman forced to recognize that the person before him operated on a level he could not dismiss. He attempted to respond, to engage with the conversation in the way he always had, composed, analytical, but there was a fraction of a delay, a hesitation, that had never existed in him before, and it was enough to reveal that control was no longer entirely his. Naomi acknowledged his points with professionalism, offering responses that were measured and direct, never dismissive, never emotional, because this was not about proving anything. It was about operating in a space she now owned completely. At one point his voice softened slightly, his words shifting away from numbers, as if searching for something beneath the surface, but she did not follow him there. She remained exactly where the conversation needed to be, anchored in purpose, refusing to let the past redefine the present. The meeting continued, each exchange reinforcing what had already become clear, that whatever connection once existed between them no longer held influence here. The room belonged to results, to decisions made without hesitation, to a future that did not include unfinished conversations. And when the final documents were placed before them, the moment carried none of the tension that might have existed years ago, only resolution. Ethan signed first, his signature firm but slower than usual, as if the act itself required acknowledgement of something deeper than business. Naomi followed without pause, her signature clean, precise, final, and when she closed the folder, the sound marked the end of more than just an agreement. It marked the completion of a cycle that had begun long before either of them understood where it would lead. She stood then, extending her hand across the table, a gesture that was both formal and definitive. Ethan looked at it for a brief second before taking it, his grip steady but lacking the certainty it once carried. And in that contact, brief and controlled, the truth settled fully into place. She had not returned to reclaim anything. She had returned as something entirely new. And as she released his hand and turned toward the door, leaving the room with the same quiet authority she entered with, Ethan Whitmore remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, understanding for the first time that losing her had not been a single decision made years ago. It had been a reality he was only now beginning to comprehend. Ethan Whitmore did not leave the building immediately. Something in him resisted the simple act of walking away, as if distance could restore the version of reality he understood. Instead, he remained seated long after the room had emptied, the city stretching beyond the glass in silent indifference to the shift that had just taken place, his reflection faintly visible against the skyline. A man who had always moved forward, now momentarily still, not because he lacked direction, but because for the first time direction did not belong solely to him. The past he had compartmentalized so efficiently no longer stayed in its place. It had crossed into the present without permission, without warning, and it did not ask to be acknowledged. It demanded to be understood. Across the building, Naomi Brooks moved through her day with the same measured precision that defined everything she built, Meetings continued, decisions were made, schedules aligned. And yet there was a subtle shift beneath it all, not in her actions but in the awareness that something long resolved had resurfaced, not as a disruption but as confirmation. Confirmation that she had moved beyond a point she once believed would define her forever. Later that afternoon, as the sun lowered over the city, casting long lines of gold across the office floor, Elias sat at his usual place near the window, his small figure framed by light as he worked through a set of building blocks, stacking them with quiet focus. Each piece placed with intention. She watched him for a moment before stepping closer, her presence enough to draw his attention without a word. He looked up with a small smile, the kind that carried trust without question, and in that moment everything else faded into clarity, because no matter what the past attempted to reclaim, this was what remained real. This was what she had built. She knelt slightly, adjusting a piece in his structure, not correcting him but guiding the balance. A silent lesson passed without explanation. Her assistant approached then, informing her that Ethan Whitmore had requested a follow-up conversation, not through formal channels, but directly, a deviation from protocol that would have meant something once. Naomi listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, and for a brief second the room held its breath, waiting for a reaction that did not come. She considered the request not as a personal matter but as a decision, weighing its relevance against everything she had constructed, because the difference now was not in his presence, it was in her position. She was no longer reacting, she was choosing, and after a moment she gave a simple instruction: schedule it, but within the structure of the existing agreement, nothing outside of it. Her voice calm, final, the boundary clear without needing emphasis. The assistant nodded and stepped away, leaving the room exactly as it had been before, but with one difference. Intention had been reaffirmed. As evening settled and the city lights returned to their steady rhythm, Ethan finally stood, his movements slower than usual, as if each step required him to acknowledge something he had avoided for years. He left the building without looking back, but the image of her remained, not as memory but as presence, something fixed and undeniable, and somewhere between the space he once controlled and the reality he now faced, a realization began to take shape, not fully formed, not yet accepted, but impossible to ignore, that the woman he once believed he could replace had not only rebuilt her life without him, she had built it in a way that no longer had space for him at all. The follow-up meeting was scheduled for late afternoon, a time when the city softened just enough to blur the edges between ambition and reflection, and when Ethan Whitmore stepped into the building again, the familiarity felt different this time, not distant but immediate, as if the space itself had already adjusted to a reality he was still trying to understand. He was escorted to a smaller conference room, more private, more deliberate, the kind of setting reserved for conversations that carried weight beyond contracts. And when he entered, Naomi Brooks was already there, seated near the window where the fading sunlight traced quiet lines across the table. She did not stand this time. She did not offer the formal gesture that had closed the previous meeting. Instead, she simply acknowledged his presence with a slight nod, an invitation not to reconnect, but to proceed. Ethan took his seat across from her, placing his hands lightly on the table. The distance between them measured not in feet, but in years that had reshaped everything. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence neither uncomfortable nor empty, but precise, as if both understood that whatever was said next would not be casual. He began first, his voice controlled but lacking the effortless certainty that once defined him. He spoke of the partnership, of long-term alignment, but the words carried a secondary layer, something unspoken that lingered beneath each sentence. Naomi listened without interruption, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, and when he finished, she responded with clarity, keeping the conversation anchored exactly where it belonged, within the scope of the agreement, her tone professional, her language exact, every response reinforcing the boundary she had already established. But then there was a shift, subtle yet undeniable, when Ethan paused, his composure holding but his intention no longer purely strategic. He asked a question that did not belong to the contract, not directly, a question about continuity, about long-term vision, framed carefully but carrying something deeper beneath its surface. Naomi recognized it immediately, not as curiosity, but as an attempt to step beyond the structure she had set, and for a brief moment she allowed the silence to extend, not as hesitation but as control. When she spoke again, her voice remained calm, but there was a firmness now, a quiet finality that did not need to be emphasized. She told him that everything relevant to the partnership had already been outlined, that clarity had always been her priority, and that she intended to keep it that way. The words were simple, but their meaning was unmistakable. The past was not part of this conversation, and it would not be introduced. Ethan absorbed this without interruption, his expression steady, but something in his eyes shifted, not outwardly, but enough to suggest that he understood exactly what she had done. She had not avoided the past. She had placed it in a position where it no longer held influence, and that was something he could not negotiate. The light outside dimmed. Further, the city transitioning into evening, reflections beginning to replace direct views in the glass. And for a moment Ethan's gaze moved beyond her, catching his own reflection faintly layered over the skyline, a reminder of who he had been and who he was now confronting. He returned his focus to her, and for the first time his words carried no strategy, only recognition. He acknowledged her success, not as a compliment but as a fact, something earned, something undeniable. Naomi accepted it with a slight nod, nothing more, because validation was no longer something she required. When the meeting concluded, there was no lingering, no attempt to extend the moment. She gathered her materials with the same precision she always carried, standing as she had done countless times before, but this time without the formality of a handshake. The boundary had already been drawn. There was nothing left to confirm. She turned toward the door, and as she did, a small figure appeared just outside the glass. Elias, waiting patiently with the quiet understanding of a child who had grown within structure and certainty. His eyes lifted as she approached, and when she opened the door, he stepped forward naturally, his presence effortless, grounding, and in that single moment, everything Ethan had not allowed himself to consider became impossible to ignore. The timing, the age, the resemblance carried not in features alone but in presence, in the way the child stood with quiet confidence. Naomi did not explain. She did not introduce. She simply placed a gentle hand on Elias's shoulder and guided him forward, moving past Ethan without pause, without acknowledgement, leaving behind not a confrontation, but a realization that settled deeper than any words could have reached. And as the door closed softly behind them, Ethan Whitmore remained where he was, understanding at last that some truths did not need to be spoken to change everything. The room remained still long after the door had closed, the faint echo of footsteps dissolving into the quiet, as Ethan Whitmore stood alone with a truth that no longer required confirmation. It settled into him slowly at first, then all at once. Not as shock, but as clarity, the kind that strips away every justification he had built over the years. His gaze fixed on the door, as if expecting it to open again, as if time might reverse itself for even a second. But it did not. It never had, and now it never would. He exhaled, the sound quieter than he intended, his hand brushing against the edge of the table where contracts still rested, agreements that suddenly felt insignificant compared to what had just been revealed without a single word. He moved then, not with urgency, but with a weight he had never carried before, leaving the room and stepping into a hallway that seemed longer than it had minutes ago, each step measured, deliberate, as if the ground itself required acknowledgement. Outside the building, the city continued as it always did, cars moving, lights shifting, people unaware that for one man everything had changed in a moment so quiet it could have been missed by anyone else. Across the street, Naomi Brooks paused, briefly before entering her car, Elias beside her, his small hand naturally finding hers. And in that simple gesture the world aligned exactly as it should. She did not look back, not because she was avoiding something, but because there was nothing behind her that needed revisiting. Everything she valued was already in front of her. She opened the door, guiding Elias inside with the same calm assurance she carried in every part of her life. And as the car door closed, the sound marked a boundary that could not be crossed again. Inside, the city lights reflected softly against the window. Elias leaned slightly toward her, his voice gentle as he asked a question about something simple, something unrelated to meetings or the past or the weight of unspoken truths. And she answered him with ease, her tone warm, present, fully there, because this was the life she had built, not out of reaction, but out of intention. And it required nothing from anyone who had once walked away from it. Back on the sidewalk, Ethan remained where he had stopped, watching the car as it merged into traffic, not following, not calling out, because even he understood that there was no place for him in that moment. Not anymore. The realization did not arrive with drama. It settled into him with quiet certainty. He had not simply lost her years ago. He had forfeited the version of life that could have existed if he had chosen differently. And now that version stood before him only long enough for him to recognize it before it disappeared again. This time permanently, he turned away slowly, the city reflecting in his eyes not as something he controlled, but as something that continued without him. And for the first time, the success he had built felt incomplete in a way he could not redefine. Because there are losses that cannot be corrected through strategy or power, only understood when it is far too late. And somewhere within the movement of the city, Naomi Brooks moved forward exactly as she always had, steady, composed, untouched by the past that once tried to define her, leaving behind not a story of revenge, but something far more powerful, a life that did not need to prove anything to anyone, especially the man who once failed to see her worth when it mattered most.